Good morning. My name is Kelly Green, and I want to thank you all for being here at today's Embracing Neurodiversity in the Workplace. This town hall is very timely for this time of month, or this time of year, I should say. This month is National Disability Employment Awareness Month. So this will be a very timely discussion. Today, we're going to talk about first defining what neurodiversity is, the characteristics of a neurodivergent, checking your biases and making sure that your unintentional biases don't affect your day-to-day diversity initiatives, the intersectionality to that DEI practices, recruiting, hiring, and retention strategies, how to curate an inclusive culture, and then at the end, we'll take some questions. I wanted to ask you, while you're going through this presentation, to ask yourself, do you have an understanding of what neurodiversity is? And if so, is that affecting your DEI initiative in any way? Is it negatively or positively directing your steps towards more inclusivity and diversity? Also, do you identify as neurodivergent? And if so, do you feel comfortable in the workplace that you're currently in disclosing your needs as a neurodivergent person? That answer should be yes. And if no, then we need to start thinking about ways that you can be more comfortable and think about putting yourself in the shoes of your employees that do have neurodivergent tendencies. First, a little bit back about me. My name is Kelly Green again. I identify as a Black woman with a physical disability, multiple sclerosis. I'm obviously a woman, and I come to you using my skills and talents and lived experiences as someone who was laid off from her job, a career that I loved very much because I disclosed my disability. Although I wasn't told that specifically, I knew that that's what it was. And after leaving my career in the music business, I struggled to find a purpose and a career that would allow me to, one, not only financially support myself, but also give me the time to live and utilize my experiences and talents that I had acquired over the years during my career. I realized quickly that there was an audience very much like me in the disability community who, for whatever reason, was no longer able to work a typical 9 to 5, but also still wanted to use their talents and feel a part of society. I moved to Atlanta for what I called a slower paced lifestyle. New York was obviously much more rigorous and intense. And so it was time for me to step back and take care of my health, as well as still continue to find a way to help the disability community. I partnered with MARTA down here in Atlanta, which is our mass transit authority system. And I created a career expo for people with disabilities who were looking for customizable employment options because, like I said, they were no longer able to work the typical 9 to 5. So that expo went off very well. I was able to help them identify not only their personal brand, but also transferable skills that they were able to use in their new quote unquote normal. But what I realized at the time is that I still had to reach out to those people managers and hiring leaders who were in charge of setting the culture that was more diverse, more inclusive. And now with my company, the Kelly Green Organization, I do just that. I help people managers and corporate leaders create a more diverse and inclusive work culture that puts the equity of disability at the forefront. I believe that by more fully participating in that type of work culture, it more fully enhances the lives of people with disabilities and those around them. So I'm happy to be here with you today, and I hope I can share just a nugget or two that you can take back to your organizations and start to implement in a way that is more inclusive with neurodiversity in mind. So what is neurodiversity? Neurodiversity is used as a term used to explain the unique ways people's brains work. While everyone's brain develops similarly, no two brains function just alike. So being neurodivergent means having a brain that works differently from the average or neurotypical person. This is a term that was created in the late 1990s by a sociologist by the name of Judith Singer. She also identified as someone who has autism, so she knew firsthand what it was like to have a brain that works differently. Originally, the term was biodiversity, and at the time that referred to people who were all living organisms who had brain waves that created different paths of processing information and communication. What she realized quickly is that neurodiversity is a broad term, but it also specifically dealt with human beings in the way that they thought. So that's why the term became neurodiversity as a way to create and identify human beings specifically in the way their brains work and the things that they believe. Neurodiversity in the workplace, in addition, is a concept that recognizes these thought patterns and different types of discrimination that happen towards people with different thinking abilities. And we'll talk about some of those characteristics shortly. So about 1 in 7 people identify as neurodivergent or neurodistinct, and we'll talk about that too in a minute. And the reason that number may vary from time to time is because there's still a stigma attached to people identifying as neurodivergent, just in the workplace and in society. People are afraid to come forward for fear of facing discrimination, or as in my case, getting fired. Neurodiversity is a very complex condition, but it's not something that can be fixed. It's also not a deformity or defect, so it's not something that we should run away from or shy away from. With tools and strategies, we can implement certain effective tools, certain communication skills that will help translate between employee and employer. There's differentiating language that we should use when working with people who are neurodivergent. Neurodiversity in a group setting can be challenging but manageable for a neurodivergent. So that means in the workplace, we need to be cognizant of what it means to be neurodivergent. They may need certain tools that someone who is neurotypical is not used to seeing or not used to employing. But it's very important to recognize the signs of a neurodivergent and be open to the idea that this may add to the bottom line of your company. You would never refer to an individual as neurodiverse. On the other hand, neurodivergence describes how a person may function or process information atypically. So a person with a learning disability, intellectual disability, or mental illness may be described as neurodivergent or neurodistinct. So it's important to recognize those two differentiating languages, especially when incorporating people who identify as neurodivergent into your workspace. Some of the characteristics, and these are not all, but the most common forms of neurodiversity are ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. So these common characteristics are taken from those conditions. And some ways people who identify as neurodivergent will have one or more of these following characteristics. But again, these are the most common ones: lack of direct eye contact, lack of feelings, emotions, empathy, lack of interest or response when spoken to, difficulty recognizing nonverbal cues, trouble concentrating and focusing, obsessing on a particular subject, and barriers in communication. And you can see why this may cause an issue or barrier for those who are neurodivergent when communicating and interacting with their coworkers. So it's up to you as the human resource managers, to recognize these characteristics, not just in the onboarding and retention process, but also in the interviewing and acquisition process. You want to make sure that the language you're using and the tools that you're using to acquire a more neurodiverse workplace, you're taking these characteristics into place. And if you need help from the outside, then that's more than welcome to bring those in. On the other hand, even though these characteristics may seem negative or not worthy of employment, people who are autistic or dyslexic may have very fine characteristics that are most employable in industries such as tech, engineering, and construction, because they have a very keen sense of data analysis, skills building. They're great at mathematics, anything that involves intense repetition and attention to detail. They're very fine in those characteristics. So even though you may have these 7 that are listed on the screen, there are others that are invisible that attribute and contribute to a more productive workplace. Using the proper language. We always want to make sure that we're using inclusive language that doesn't leave anybody out. So one example would be, instead of he and she, using they and them. That's just one small example. But when you're dealing with someone who is neurodivergent or has a disability, you want to make sure that you're using language that's inclusive and also includes them and their condition. Over the past few years, person first has become the preference, although it depends on the individual that you're speaking to. And I always say that when in doubt, ask. I, as a person with a disability, would much rather for you to ask me than assume what I would like to be referred to. And if you make a mistake throughout the way, it's no big deal. Please apologize immediately and correct yourself going forward. These are things that we were taught and brought up learning how to say. So this is a change that won't happen overnight. Person first language is when you put the personhood of that person in front of their condition. The reason why I prefer this is because obviously we don't want to be known as just our condition. We are a whole person with a lot of intersecting identities, which is why when I identified myself in the beginning, I identified as a woman, a Black woman, a person with a disability, not just a disabled person. I am so much more than that, and I bring a lot to the table, as do all of us. Identity first is when you put the identity of the person first, negating their personhood. Some examples would be an autistic child, a diabetic person, a paraplegic, stroke victim, blind or deaf, wheelchair user, disabled or handicapped person. I personally can't stand the term disabled or handicapped, but again, those are terms that we grew up knowing, grew up using, so this change will not happen overnight. Some examples of a person first language are child on the autism spectrum, a person with their diabetes, a person who uses a wheelchair, or a person with a disability. I'll give you an example though. Identity first, blind or deaf person. I have a friend who is actually blind, and he does prefer to be called blind as opposed to visually impaired. I also met a lot of people in his community who also prefer the term blind as opposed to visually impaired or low vision, even though those must be the most current terms and the most politically correct. It just depends on the individual in the circles in which you're speaking. And the only reason why I knew that he preferred that is because I've heard him refer to himself as blind. I asked him just to be sure after a couple of times hearing him say it, and he told me for sure that he preferred the term blind as opposed to anything others. So like I said, when in doubt, just ask. It's much better to ask and be sure than to assume. Speaking of languages, there are also biases in our cultural backgrounds that influence the language that we may use. And I want to go over a few of the neurotypical biases that we tend to use most often, or tend to come into play without us even recognizing sometimes that they are at play in our decision-making and our behavior within the organization. The first neurotypical bias is the confirmation bias. And we all know someone like this who uses their own biases to make sure that other people think and believe the same way that they do. So this is the tendency to seek out, favor, or recall information that confirms one's existing beliefs or opinions. So for example, the person with the confirmation bias will only seek out news sources who confirm their values and beliefs. So for instance, your views on reproductive rights, you will only tend to believe anything that confirms your already existing belief and your bias. The second one is the hindsight bias. And this is someone that I call the know-it-all. The hindsight bias is the person who believes that without any evidence or without any proof that an event that occurred, they already knew the outcome of. So for example, that person may say they knew the outcome of the game or lottery or an election. And that's just obviously not true. And we know it's not true, but that person brings those biases into the workplace. The next one is the false consensus effect. And this happens a lot in the workplace. We assume that because we spend 5 days a week, 8 hours a day with someone, that they think and believe in our views and hold the same values and morals, when nothing could be further from the truth. Only because you see this one slice of that person throughout their world of working, their career world, it doesn't mean that they hold those same thoughts and beliefs outside of work. So this is the tendency to overestimate to extent to which one shares his own beliefs and behaviors. So for example, a neurotypical person might assume that most people with their political or religious views are the same as they are because they work in the same place, and then be surprised or offended when they find out that that person's views are totally different. And lastly, there's the theory of mind bias. And this is really important as well. I mean, they're all important, but especially as a people manager or a corporate leader, this is the tendency to attribute mental states such as thoughts, feelings, or intentions to other people based on your own perspective. So for example, a neurotypical person might think that an autistic person is being rude or cold because they don't interact or they're not a quote unquote team player, but that's because they are neurodivergent and their brain operates differently. So it's important during the hiring process to keep these biases in mind, and when they come, and be cognizant of when they come up so you can push them away and go in with a clean slate and give everyone an equal opportunity. There are many benefits of embracing neurodiversity. 3 in particular I want to talk about today are: 1 is signals to your employees the type of corporate culture you want to create. This helps to attract the same employees that would embrace the type of culture that you're creating. It also helps to that employer to, that employee to model the behavior that you're trying to create within your workplace. So it happens from the top down. You set the tone for the type of culture that you want, and it also emanates from the inside out. So the messages in your values and mission statement should portray the type of culture that you are, so that in your marketing and advertising, those things become very clear to your prospective employees as well as prospective customers and clients. It also signals to your community the type of organization that you are and the type of organization that you want to create. Especially for brick and mortars, you want to make sure that the community that you're in represents the talent pool that you have within the organization. It shows a clear intent and authenticity that the community will appreciate and buy into. You need buy-in from the community in order to operate in that community. And 3rd, it signals to your customers the type of company that you are. Some companies that do that very well are Target, The Gap, Starbucks, Publix, which is a grocery chain down here in the Southeast. And let's see, there are a couple others that do it very well in their marketing and advertising campaigns. Not only do they show people from diverse and different cultures and different backgrounds in their advertising, but you also see it in the talent pool. They have front and center people with clear, visible disabilities that work within the stores, that will greet you as soon as you come into the stores. So you appreciate the kind of atmosphere and kind of environment that they are creating. It also signals to your customers that you are open and that you are an authentic place of diversity and inclusion. There are some other companies that do this that you wouldn't even recognize. And I'm sorry, I'm going to use my notes for a second because I want to make sure I get these numbers right, especially if you're in a position of trying to convince your leaders that they need to be more inclusive or create neurodiversity specific programs. These companies, JP Morgan Chase, Ernst Young, Microsoft, and Department of Defense have very neuro-specific programming that have shown that they get a better bottom line because they've implemented these processes and these programs along the way to attract these very specific employees. So as a part of these efforts, many of these organizations create and grow partnerships with nonprofits, and I want you to look into this in your own organization. These nonprofits, service providers, and state and local agencies to ensure that their hiring programs can be specific and successful. They have reached out to these, so for instance, a workforce development agency in your area may work with people who are neurodivergent or have certain disabilities. They have already pre-screened these people. In some places, they've trained them. They know specifically what their faults and what their strengths are. So they come to you already prepared. You obviously just have to acclimate them into the environment. But by working with these third parties, you get a very specific talent that you're looking for to create a more neurodiverse program. According to a 2018 Deloitte report, companies with inclusive cultures were 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile. Research suggests that teams with neurodivergent professionals in some roles can be up to 30% more productive than without them. JP Morgan Chase, for example, had a program called Autism at Works. After they utilized it and had such great success, they also realized that there was much more to the neurodiversity spectrum than just people with autism. So they changed the name to Neurodiversity at Work. This initiative found that their neurodiverse hires were on average 90 to 140% more productive than employees that have been at the company for 5 to 10 years. Those numbers are non-disputable. They have the evidence to back it up. And if you need more evidence to show that neurodiversity at work works, this is it. This number right here is the number that you need. Neurodiverse employees tend to be more loyal to a good company and have a higher retention rate. If you don't know, you should recognize that it takes at least 6 to 9 months worth of salary to replace a current employee with a new one. So why not work from what you have within? You want to mold and encourage those particular workers to stay around at your program and keep them in places where they thrive the best. Let's explore intersectionality. Again, I gave you my intersecting identities in the very beginning. All of us have those intersecting identities. And as you can see from this Venn diagram, they overlap, which means that they influence our behavior and our the way we move throughout the day in our workplace, in our family, in society. So for me, being a Black woman with a disability, navigates how I see the world and how the world sees me. The important distinction of intersectionality is these places of marginalization are not separate in creating harmful discriminatory practices, but are interconnected and often compound one another, which means that based on your intersectionality and your proximity to privilege will depend on what type and how much discrimination you face. The more intersections you have and the further you are from privilege, then obviously the more discrimination you may find, but you're not exactly sure where that discrimination is emanating from. So it's important to understand the intersectionality and how it guides our everyday lives and attitudes in order to recognize when that discrimination is taking place and making sure that it stays at bay. Intersectionality is a term based in Black feminism. It was created by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a former UCLA law professor. And she created this term to help us identify when, like I said, these identities are overlapping and when they create a hostile or unsafe work environment. Intersectional neurodiversity is more common than not in the corporate work sphere. Because of this, companies are beginning to embrace it as a key component of their talent management strategy. And this comes from Optimize, which is a neurodiversity training platform. Neuroinclusivity benefits everyone, not just the direct employee and direct hire. So for one, it helps to clarify clear career paths. As I said, someone who is on the autism spectrum may do very well at repetitive, consistent job tasks, whereas someone else might find it mundane and very boring. So it's important to identify whether that person who identifies as autistic wants to move up within the company or whether they want to stay where they are and excel at what it is that they're doing. When I did the career summit with Marta a few years ago, I realized that there was this one in particular individual I was working with, and he had autism. He was on the autism spectrum, and he worked very well in the hospitality industry. And the hospitality industry actually sought out people with autism because of the success they had with this particular program. He liked to be in the laundry room folding towels and sheets because for him, that provided consistency, also a sense of belonging and accomplishment, whereas someone else might find that boring and mundane. So it's better to realize a person's potential and make sure that they excel in that particular position. Neuroinclusivity also unmasks any blind spots and stereotypes that we may be holding because of the biases in our cultural backgrounds. So understanding those neurotypical biases that we talked about before will help you with unmasking these blind spots and making sure that you're not holding on to any stereotypes of a person with autism or a person who's dyslexic. You want to amplify those voices from within. Not all persons with neurodivergence will want to come forward and use their voice to change the culture. But there are some voices within who may have a loved one who's neurodivergent or live with someone who's neurodivergent. So they're familiar with some of their physical attributes as well as their invisible attributes. So using those voices from within, but making it clear from the top that those voices are welcome and you want to hear from them will help to amplify those voices from within. Now, when you do find someone who is neurodivergent, who wants to come forward and wants to help and give their input, that's fine. Do not expect that person, though, to be the mascot for the neurodivergent community. They can help as much as or as little as they want, and any help that they're willing to give is acceptable. You want to encourage others to participate in inclusion strategies. A lot of times as a neurotypical person, they may look at someone who has special needs, and I don't even want to say special needs, I'm sorry. They may need certain accommodations, and we all need certain accommodations, just like a woman going on maternity leave, she needs accommodations. That doesn't say that's not to say that she has special needs. Those are just accommodations that help her with her lifestyle and work-life balance. So encouraging others to participate in inclusion strategies makes them feel a part of the solution, and not just as neurodivergent people are getting special treatment, because that's not what this is. This is all about the bottom line of that company and creating more inclusive workspaces. And being open fundamentally optimizes the culture of your organization, and that's our ultimate goal. There are some proven outcomes of neurodiversity in the workplace. Of course, there's increased productivity, which obviously we all want, improvement in the quality of talent that we have, optimize innovative capabilities, a variance of perspectives and thinking, increase employee engagement, and a more equitable culture. All of this leads to an intense and growth in the bottom line. So how do we create that culture that's going to create the outcomes that we want? You want to first rethink your recruiting and hiring process. You want to build your company from within, looking at the people with those talents that you're looking for and that help promote productivity. Productivity is what you're looking for. You want to communicate using accessible language and media. Are you creating meetings that use an ASL interpreter, closed captioning, making sure that people who aren't physically able to be in one location have access to the meetings and whatever tools and strategies that they need? Make sure you're using that before it needs to be asked of. That will let new employees coming in know that this is a safe, psychologically safe space, and they can ask for what they need. Partner with those workforce development agencies that we talked about later will help you to highlight the exact skills and talents that you're looking for and make sure that you are pinpointing exactly the type of talent that will work within your organization. And use social media. As someone with a physical disability, it may not be possible for me to get around and do as much physically as a non-disabled employee would. So using social media is a great way to get to somebody like me as a potential employee and as a customer and client. Understanding who your ideal target audience is will help you pinpoint exactly which social media platforms you should be using. Also, you want to use that inclusive language on those platforms. You want to go beyond the ADA requirements. That's the Americans with Disabilities Act, which will give you a checklist of the physical barriers that you need to knock down in order to have a more inclusive workplace, but you want to go beyond just that checklist. Identify the gaps and diagnose the root causes of where those barriers may be occurring. This may mean employing someone who is neurodivergent or has a physical disability to help you in those accommodations. If you don't have someone within your organization who is either willing to help or unable or unwilling to disclose, it's important for you to reach out to communities that will help you with that, because there are plenty in each and every state. Acknowledge when a person discloses their disability to you. Thank them for their disclosure. You want to include HR in the conversation if need be, but you want to make sure during the interview process, you're letting them know that any accommodations that they need, whether you can see their disability or not, any accommodations that they need can be granted. And finally, for this group, you want to make sure you are encouraging ERG groups and affinity groups, that's employee resource groups, to use their voice and use their resources for good. So instead of just a monthly meeting where you give donuts and coffee, you want to make sure that these ER groups are actually engaged and have objectives to increase the type of diversity that you want to see within your company. Also, you want to encourage collaboration between these groups, making sure that, say, the disability group and the Blacks in Leadership group are talking and partnering with each other on their objectives, because a lot of times they will overlap because of those intersectionalities that we talked about earlier. Like I said, you want to cultivate talent from within, look at distinct talents and for each individual, keep the environment as stable as possible. In particular, people with autism or on autism spectrum like consistency. They thrive in those environments. And I know with the type of world that we're living in, things are forever changing, and they're changing at a quick pace. So keep that two-way communication open so that they understand when and why change is happening. Those create the best results for people in the autism spectrum. You also want to create a psychologically safe space. For me, if I felt like I was more psychologically protected, then I would have gone about my disclosure very differently than I did. And that was a lack of knowledge on my part, but also because I did not feel that I was in a space to do so. So creating those psychologically safe spaces, again, before it's asked or requested, you want to make sure that people know that they are in a safe space where they can learn, share, and open up. You want to promote best practices whenever possible. Be open to feedback. We don't know it all as leaders in our corporation. We like to think that we do, but be open to feedback and take it into account. A lot of times these are reasonable accommodations, which is what you're required to do as part of the ADA, provide these reasonable accommodations. But some of them at first may seem unreasonable, but it actually adds to the betterment of the entire company, not just the person that's requesting those accommodations. Remember that your influence holds power, so the tone and tenor that you set for your company resonates throughout the company. If you want your employees to be more intentional, then you have to set that tone from the beginning. And also be more intentional in your DEI work. It's not just about gender and race, but it's about all of the intersecting identities that we talked about before. And finally, in conclusion, you want to make sure that you're introducing neuro inclusion to your organization as an imperative DEI strategy. It assists the teams without stigma and judgment. It allows you to address the marginalization gap. Remember, we talked about that Venn diagram. There are going to be gaps within those identities, but once you recognize what they are and address them, then you can help close that marginalization gap. It also encourages leaders to provide tailored support centered around neurodivergent talent with their input. And with that, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. Again, my name is Kelly Green, and I appreciate you taking the time out today to join us and learn more about neurodiversity in the workplace.